On a cold April night in 1944, as thousands of US troops shivered offshore in yet another training exercise for the upcoming Normandy landings, 9 darkened vessels, bristling with torpedoes and guns, slipped unseen through the shallow waters off the coast of Devon in southwest England. They stayed only a few hours, but by the time they had left, hundreds of American servicemen were dead, drowned, frozen, burned, or simply disappeared in the chaos of that night. This is the story of Exercise Tiger. To understand exactly what happened here that night, we need to first consider what brought the Americans to this sleepy part of Britain. So let's wind the clock back to 1943, by which time the UK was transforming into a springboard for the opening of the long-awaited Second Front in Europe. Huge numbers of US troops and masses of war material had been flowing across the Atlantic for months, joining British and Canadian forces already in place around the country. The task was truly monumental. Hundreds of staging centres, logistics hubs, tented encampments, transportation links and training areas were established to support the top-secret invasion plans. Earmarked as an amphibious training area before the outbreak of war and then taken over for the training of American forces for D-Day was this area, next to the quiet village of Torcross in South Devon, adjacent to a long strand of beach known as Slapton Sands. Although invasion plans were cloaked in secrecy, those in the know had identified this beach as a near-identical representation of what would be eventually codenamed Utah in Normandy. As we can see from this wartime image, it was not necessarily just the beach that resembled the proposed landing site, but also the remarkable likeness of the countryside inland, seen here as a patchwork of fields, separated by high hedges and narrow lanes, almost identical to Normandy's infamous bocage. To maintain that secrecy as preparations continued, over 3,000 local inhabitants were evacuated from the surrounding 6 parishes from as early as November 1943 to establish a 25 square mile tract of land where amphibious assault and infiltration training could take place. With all this nearby, it was no surprise then that South Devon would see an influx of more than 30,000 American troops, transforming the peaceful countryside into a hive of military activity. Throughout the early months of 1944, preparations, planning and training exercises gathered both in pace and complexity across the whole of Britain, particularly building on how to embark, transport, land and integrate the immense multinational force needed to assault the beaches in France. Although their ultimate destination was still unknown, Major General Lightning Joe Collins' US 7th Corps had been steadily training and were now prepared for a full dress rehearsal involving all of Task Force U, scheduled to take place between the 22nd and 30th of April 1944, Exercise Tiger at Slapton Sands. It was an enormous task of almost unbelievable complexity, with 4th Infantry Division, the 4th Cavalry Group, the 6th Armoured Group and the 1st Special Engineer Brigade, plus 2 entire airborne divisions, the 82nd and the 101st, involved. For the first 3 days, the exercise focused on transporting units to their respective ports of departure and, importantly, embarking them in the correct order onto the various shapes and sizes of landing ships and support vessels, a terrific task in its own right. This was completed by the evening of the 26th of April, and the next phase was to set sail, marshal almost 300 ships at sea into Task Force U under the command of Admiral Don P. Moon, and to simulate a full channel crossing using a circuitous route around Lime Bay to expose troops to time afloat before approaching Slapton Sands for landing rehearsals early on the following morning. Once ashore, the exercise would also include these troops linking up with the airborne divisions who will be put in place by vehicle inland, mirroring the actual plan for D-Day in all respects. Dedicated escort protection of Task Force U is to be provided by the Royal Navy using 4 O-class destroyers, 3 motor torpedo boats and 2 motor gunboats. 3 more motor torpedo boats were also positioned off Cherbourg to act as guard ships against interference by German E-boats known to be based there. So, with all finally in place, at 7:30 am on the morning of Thursday the 27th of April, the full-scale exercise could begin, and almost immediately, tragedy struck. To best simulate real battle conditions and harden the men to the coming experience, the landings were to be preceded by a massive live naval bombardment onto the beach at 50 minutes before H-hour. But, due to some of the landing ships being late at their points of disembarkation, Admiral Moon had decided to delay H-hour to 8:30 am. Tragically, many of those troops had already transferred to their landing craft by the time news was sent and were already making their way inshore. A confused situation, which even today remains somewhat unclear, meant that some of the second wave of landing craft who did not receive the change in orders proceeded to land at their original planned time, arriving at the beach at exactly the time that a massive naval bombardment slammed into shore. The result was absolute carnage, as friendly shells devastated the exposed troops who fell as easily to their own as to enemy shells. The true cost of that day will likely never be known, but some estimates give casualty figures as high as 450 men. Despite that blunder, it was imperative that the exercise be completed and practice landings were continued throughout the rest of the 27th of April, as these remarkable photographs taken by an Allied reconnaissance aircraft show, with troops coming ashore and linking up with parties of paratroopers as they would do for real in Normandy. With most of the infantry ashore and the beach simulated as secure at 3:30 p.m, follow-on elements of the task force second echelon continued to form up and prepare for their own landings as night fell over Slapton sands. Amongst them was Convoy T4, comprising 8 landing ship tanks or LSTs under the command of New Yorker Commander Bernard Scarhill. Making their rendezvous here in Lime Bay, the vessels in the convoy continued preparations for going ashore the following morning, the 28th of April. Many never would. Let's look a little closer at Convoy T4. Taking up a 3-mile line astern formation heading southwest towards Slapton Sands, the corvette HMS Azalea was leading the LSTs, which were at 700-yard intervals in the order of 515, 496, 511, 531, 58, 499, 289 and finally 507. The second escort destroyer allocated to the convoy as the screening unit, HMS Scimitar, had suffered a collision with another vessel earlier and had returned to Plymouth for repairs, which Commander Scarhill was not aware of due to communications issues. Convoy T4 was therefore fully laden with troops, fueled tanks and vehicles, medical teams, engineering detachments, slow in its ability to manoeuvre and lacking protection in the extreme. Importantly, they were also not all on the same radio frequencies. The massive amount of activity on the British south coast at that time was of course not going unnoticed to the Germans on the other side of the English Channel, especially amongst officers of the Kriegsmarines 5th, 6th and 9th S or Schnellboote flotillas based right here in Cherbourg. Literally meaning fast boats, but best known in Allied circles as E or enemy boats, they presented a very real threat in the English Channel. With a top speed of almost 50 miles per hour, crewed by around 20 men and heavily armed with torpedoes, flak and machine guns, they were incredibly effective short-range strike vessels. In fact, already in 1944 those craft had shown their worth. Back on the 6th of January, 7 E-boats under command of Captain Lieutenant Karl Müller had slipped past naval defences on the Cornish coast and had run square into convoy WP 457 as it rounded Land's End. Attacked at 3 a.m, the convoy had been taken by complete surprise, and in just a few minutes HMS Wolsey, MV Polpero, MV Underwood and the Swedish cargo ship SS Solstad were sunk by torpedoes with significant loss of life. Now, on the 27th of April, the ever-watchful Kriegsmarine at Cherbourg sensed another opportunity, and shortly after 10 p.m, loaded with fuel, torpedoes and men, 9 E-boats slipped away from port. Destination? Lime Bay. Back out offshore, US naval commanders would have no doubt kept a close eye on the time as the exercise continued to unfold, which as a matter of fact is a great segue into our sponsor for this video, Vaer watches. I can honestly say this from experience, Vaer are great. Not only do the team there love military history, but they reflect that passion in each design and they make outstanding watches. There are loads of models to choose from, each with its own unique style, but this has to be one of my favourites, the C4 Tactical. Designed to super high spec and inspired by the legendary Benrus Type 1 diver issued to Navy SEALs in the 1970s, it's a perfect blend of style and function. As a hard-wearing solar, just 6 hours of daylight provides 6 months of power. It has great nighttime loom, matte finish and anti-reflective surfaces, it's comfortable and its Epson VS42 movement makes it extremely accurate too. And of course, fully waterproof up to 200 meters. And let's be fair, it looks amazing. I wear my Vaer on a daily basis, and I'm not just saying this, they're a real quality brand and could be worn in pretty much any situation. So if you want to support us and the people who make videos like this possible, be sure to check it out at the link below. And so, just after midnight, the 9-vessel German force, having slipped by the Royal Navy protective screen, had reached just here, unseen but not undetected. In fact, British radar stations had picked up the approaching hostile force to the southeast and broadcasted the news, but fatefully not to Convoy T4, who were operating on a different radio frequency and so never got the news. Within just minutes, 6 E-boats of the 5th Flotilla under the command of Corvette Captain Bernhard Klug sighted the LST formation strung out ahead of them. Originally expecting to find a merchant convoy, in the darkness he was confused by the unusual shape of the enemy ships, but still ordered his boats to form up for an attack with torpedoes in 3 pairs. Although we don't know how many, at about 1 AM the first of a salvo of torpedoes were launched towards the vulnerable convoy, with Klug no doubt watching on and counting down the time as he prepared for impact. 15 seconds, 10 seconds, 5 seconds, nothing. There's a little confusion around this even today, but the most likely scenario is those torpedoes, primed to tear open the deep hulls of merchantmen, had sailed silently under the much more shallow draft LSTs, with the only effect being that they alerted the convoy to its presence. The first attack a failure, Klug had regrouped his force by 1:30 AM and presumably during that time reprogrammed their torpedoes for shallow running, before again setting off in chase of their prey. Just here, the 3rd formation pair, or Rotte, of Schnellboote, S136 and S138, headed towards the eastern end of the group, where they sighted LST 507 at the tail end of the line and set up for an attack. On board 507, Lieutenant Eugene E. Exum, a US Naval Reserve medical officer from Madison, Wisconsin, knew that something was wrong. General quarters rudely aroused us at about 01:30. I remember hearing gunfiring saying that they had better watch where they were shooting or someone would get hurt. 02:03, I was stupidly trying to go topside, see what was going on. Suddenly, there was a horrendous noise accompanied by the sound of crunching metal and dust everywhere. The lights went out and I was thrust violently into the air to land on the steel deck on my knees, which became very sore immediately thereafter. Now I knew how getting torpedoed felt. But I was lucky. LST 507's fate was sealed. Although official German records tell a confused story, it's believed that a single torpedo fired by either S136 or S138 tore into the ship. The carnage was indescribable and a fire rapidly took hold, creating a furnace of burning fuel and ammunition that forced those lucky enough to get on deck, including Eugene Exum, to escape to take their chances in the cold water of the English Channel. The ship remained afloat for another 2 hours, but 202 naval and army personnel were lost. Meanwhile, within 15 minutes, LST 531 met a similar fate. Struck by 2 torpedoes fired by either S100 or S143 in Klug's first formation pair, she exploded in a huge fireball, lighting the sky for miles around. But unlike those on LST 507, those on board did not have the luxury of time, and she sank in just 10 minutes, taking with her the bulk of the crew and unfortunate soldiers on board. Ensign Douglas Harlander, another Wisconsin man from Frederick, recalled the terror and suffering of those who went into the water. As I swam away from the ship, I noticed a small life raft that had managed to be launched about 20 yards away, being clung onto by survivors. 2 men lay in the middle of the raft and 15 others hung on the outside of the raft, their legs in the water. The big problem was the water was 44 degrees, mighty cold. The first half hour the water felt cold, but after that your arms and legs just got numb and you couldn't feel the water. You couldn't hang on to anything either. As the night progressed, there were fewer people around. They slipped away as they became unconscious. Only 72 of the 496 men aboard LST 531 when she was hit would live to tell the tale. It's difficult to imagine the chaos and the scene viewed from the other vessels. E-boats continued to zip through the convoy, seeking new targets of opportunity with their guns. Indeed, LST 496 and LST 511 appear to have had a friendly fire incident in the confusion as both tried to engage E-boats passing between them. This may have been Klug's second formation pair, S140 and S142. To make matters worse, 3 more E-boats of Corvette Captain Godfreiherr von Mirbach's 9th Flotilla, S130, S145 and S150, now joined the fray from the southeast after being attracted by the explosions and tracer fire of the ongoing battle. It was probably S-145 that fired the torpedoes which struck LST-289 at around 2:30 am. Although she suffered major damage and the loss of 13 of her crew, it was the quick thinking of her skipper, Lieutenant Harry H. Maptiler, who took evasive action after spotting the torpedoes, manoeuvring to take the hit on the stern rather than the beam. It surely saved the ship, and she was able to make her way to Dartmouth under her own steam. By 3:30 am, after unleashing carnage in the seas off Slapton Sands, the Germans withdrew into the darkness and made their way back to port. It had been a tremendously successful attack, with only 2 E-boats, S-100 and S-143, suffering damage, though not through US fire, but due to them colliding with each other during the attack. But they left behind a tragic scene. LST-531 had sunk. LST-507 was still burning, would eventually sink around 4:30 am, and in accordance with standard procedures, the convoy had dispersed, leaving hundreds of sailors and GIs, mainly from the 557th Quartermaster Railhead Company and the 3206th Quartermaster Service Company, alone in the water. Many drowned due to a poor life jacket design which flipped men upside down when wearing their combat gear, whilst others succumbed to wounds in the minutes to come. LST-515 was one of the first vessels to return to the scene to pick up survivors, arriving with HMS Scimitar's replacement, HMS Saladin, too late to defend the group, but now on hand for a desperate rescue mission. But by then, most of those had been in the water for almost 2 hours. Huge numbers had died from hypothermia, and as dawn broke, more small vessels came onto the scene to look for those still alive, and worryingly, 10 of those still missing were from the 1st Engineer Special Brigade, who had bigot security clearances and inside knowledge of the precise details of the forthcoming landings at Utah and Omaha in Normandy. Incredibly, all 10 were subsequently recovered. But with the invasion looming, the debacle of Exercise Tiger remained a closely guarded secret, and there are many references made by survivors to the threat of court-martial for those who spoke out in order to protect operational security. Although painful lessons were learned which would be adopted for D-Day, such secrecy has led to some conjecture surrounding the number of casualties sustained on that night. A report issued in August 1944 stated that a total of 639 US seamen and soldiers lost their lives during the attack, which does stack up against the fatality figures given for the LSTs that were either sunk or damaged. The American Memorial in Weymouth, England, however, commemorates 749 killed, which may also include other training fatalities recorded at that time. But the overall number killed during the exercise is generally accepted to be 946. What is certain is that the losses in Exercise Tiger far exceeded the estimated 300 casualties sustained on Utah Beach on the morning of the 6th of June 1944. This was a sacrifice that should never be forgotten, and today, a solitary Sherman tank recovered from the sea off Slapton Sands by Torcross resident Ken Small in 1984 stands guard in the village, overlooking the beach, which was the unachieved destination for the troops in Convoy T4 on that fateful night in April 1944. Thanks for watching, and a huge thanks to our sponsors for this video, Vaer. Be sure to check out their fantastic collection of watches at the link below. And for those with an interest in World War II generally, why not check out World War II Both Sides of the Wire, our dedicated podcast in which each week our hosts Professor Matthias Strone and Jesse Alexander explore famous episodes from the conflict from both the Allied and Axis perspectives. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon. To make matters worse, 3 more E-boats of Corvette and Captain God's Freiherr von